Welcome, members, guests, and speakers. Thank you all for attending in person and online. My name is Linda Smith, and I'm honored to serve as the Program Director for the League of Women Voters of Salt Lake. We are very pleased to have an expert panel present on an important topic, state and local government relations. As is our tradition, I would like to begin with this acknowledgement. We gather here on sacred ground, loved, cared for, protected, and cherished over the ages, and to this day, by the Ute, Goshute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples. We commit to follow their lead. For 100 years, the League of Women Voters has been a nonpartisan, activist, grassroots organization and believes voters should play a critical role in democracy. We encourage informed and active participation in government, work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influence public policy through education and advocacy. Simply put, our mission is to empower voters and to defend democracy. February is Membership Drive Month, and we have welcomed many new members. There is still time for current members to bring in new members and be invited to our membership open house on March 13th. Unfortunately, since renewals and new memberships are combined in the new national format bureaucracy, I am not able to read the names of our new members, but welcome to you all. If any new members are present, would you please stand so we can personally welcome you? Yes. Oh, 2 new members. Excellent. Moving on. A recording of tonight's event will be made available to the public on the League of Women Voters of Salt Lake website, lwvsl.org, and on our social media. Other recordings of this event, whether they be in person or of a computer screen, may not be used without the express written approval of the League. The League will only allow audio video of this event to be broadcast in its entirety, except by the media reporting on the event. There will be some important League announcements at the end of the presentation. Now, we are fortunate to have a panel with experience working in state government, in local government, and in the private sector, and in the nonprofit sector, and yet only 3 of them. Our first speaker will be Dr. Tim Tingey. He has worked for over 25 years in education, government, and nonprofit organizations as a public administrator. He is currently a full-time faculty member in the Division of Public Affairs in the Political Science Department at the University of Utah. He serves as Chief Administrative Officer at NeighborWorks, Salt Lake City. He recently served for 6 years as the City Manager and Chief Executive Officer for Cottonwood Heights City, overseeing all executive and administrative functions of the community. He previously worked as the Director of Administrative and Developmental Services for Murray City Corporation, managing 7 divisions for the city, and was Executive Director for the Redevelopment Agency of Murray. He also worked for the City of Pocatello for 11 years in planning, grant administration, and economic development. Dr. Tingey holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Business Management, Human Resources from Utah State University, and has a Master's of Public Administration and a doctorate in Political Science from Idaho State University. He was an adjunct faculty member at Idaho State University, teaching graduate and undergraduate courses in public administration and political science. He worked as an adjunct faculty member for the University of Utah since 2014, and in 2023 received an appointment as a core faculty member for the program. Dr. Tingey will speak first, but I'm going to do the other introductions at this point. Karson Eilers, on the far end of the table, is the Utah League of Cities and Towns Policy Director. He grew up in Salt Lake City. After graduating from East High School, Karson joined the National Civilian Community Corps to help communities around the country with disaster preparedness. He returned home to attend Westminster College, graduating cum laude with a BA in economics and a minor in political science. After interning with the Utah State House of Representatives in 2017, he joined the Utah League of Cities and Towns as a policy intern and stayed around. Karson obtained a MS in Business Analytics from the University of Utah in 2023 while working at the League. Part policy wonk and part data nerd, in his free time, he enjoys rock climbing, skiing, and mountain biking in Utah's incredible mountains and deserts with his family and friends. And last but not least, in the middle of our trio is Chris Gamvroulas, president of Ivory Development, the land acquisition and development affiliate for Ivory Homes. Chris joined Ivory Homes in 1993 and became active in land development in 1996. Since that time, Chris has overseen the land acquisition, planning, entitlement, and construction of over 20,000 home sites in approximately 600 different communities and hundreds of acres of retail, industrial, and commercial properties, totaling nearly $2.5 billion in real estate assets. The Ivory family of companies includes Ivory Homes, Ivory Development, and Ivory Commercial. Prior to joining Ivory, Chris worked in state government for 8 years in several capacities, including 3 years as Assistant Director of the Division of Business and Economic Development and 5 years at Utah Films Commission. Chris completed the Harvard Business School Advanced Management Program and holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science from the University of Utah. In 2006, Chris was recognized as a 40 under 40 business leader by Utah Business Magazine. In 2007, he was featured in Utah Business Magazine's Utah's Most Admired Companies and has been a past recipient of the Salt Lake Home Builders Association President's Award for Outstanding Achievement. In 1998, Chris was appointed to the Utah Homeless Coordinating Committee by Governor Mike Leavitt. In 2018, he was appointed to the Utah Commission on Housing Affordability by Governor Gary Herbert. Chris also serves in leadership positions on the boards of various community and civic groups, such as Dominion Energy, Western Advisory Council, National Association of Home Builders, Utah Commission on Housing Affordability, Chair of the Salt Lake City Redevelopment Agency Advisory Committee, Executive Committee of the Salt Lake Chamber Board of Governors, President of the Utah Property Rights Coalition, Chair of the Advancement Board of the College of Social and Behavioral Science at the University of Utah, and Chair of the Better Business Bureau of Utah. I hope you're all suitably impressed with the level of expertise we have recruited this evening. And now we're going to begin with Dr. Tingey, who has a PowerPoint presentation because such are required of faculty members.
And as I told Chris and Karson, it's a 75 slide PowerPoint. I'm just joking. That's always how I start the program, to kind of worry people a little bit. But I've known these two individuals for a long time, and I've appreciated my working relationship with both of them, Chris and Karson. We've been in a lot of meetings together and worked on things together as well for a lot of years. And so I'm privileged to be sitting here with them and grateful for this opportunity to be with all of you to talk about these things. I just want to give a little bit of the context of the relationship between state and local governments. There were times when I was a city manager when, especially during the legislature, there were some residents and citizens that would say, you know, what does it matter what the legislature is doing? We have the city and we can govern what we want to. And that's not necessarily the case. And I think it's important to really understand context and the working relationship. And there are tensions at times, but there are also many, many times, and it's probably not as much in the news media, where state and local governments are working side by side, hand in hand, to try to solve some very challenging issues and problems. And I'm grateful that we do have the state government working with local government in these areas, and both of these individuals are aware of that significantly. So real quickly, just let me give you some context. I'm not going to take a lot of time, but back in 1868, there was a Supreme Court case called the City of Clinton versus Cedar Rapids, and it kind of shaped the relationship between state and local government. And really the ruling, this is a lot of words here, I'm not going to read all of this, but the ruling focused on municipal origins owing their origin to and deriving it from the powers of the state, from the state legislature. It's called the Dillon's Rule, is what we're talking about. And it breathes, as it said in the case, it breathes into them the breath of life, without which they cannot exist. And so there are many states in the United States that really focus on this Dillon's Rule. They have this as the governing structure. And basically the legislature might, by a single act, they can eliminate local governments. In Utah, we're not under the Dillon's Rule. I mean, it evolved into what we call the Home Rule, And this is what it defines it as. And there's 31 states that have the home rule. Some have different variations of that. The state of Utah is a home rule state, but a limited home rule state, and I'll explain that in a minute. But basically what it is it grants local governments power to pass laws to govern themselves as they see fit. That's what home rule focuses on. The level of home rule is stipulated by the state, and it's consistent with the Dillon rule, but it also gives states, they expressly grant local governments the power to govern. And so for specifically in the state of Utah, they govern, or they allow the state or the cities and local governments to develop their own structure, or the structure, the form of government, whether it's a city manager or a strong mayor form of government. It also gives them opportunity for fiscal structure, to tax and to do bonds and to raise funding for the services they provide. It also gives them other elements to allow for the administration of personnel and several other areas. But the state of Utah grants that to local governments, to cities specifically, but it is a limited element. So it's not guaranteed in the state constitution. So some states do guarantee it in the state constitution, but we're a limited home rule state, which they grant those rights, but it's not defined in the state constitution. So there can be some limitations and changes that are made with that. This is the article and section that the legislature by statute provides for the incorporation, or allows cities to incorporate, organize, dissolve if needed, and it gives the classifications as well. Just a couple of other things. I already mentioned the Constitution talks about grants broad powers for cities and state law, and local governments. They have broad power, but also the state of Utah can basically, if they speak with sufficient clarity, they can preempt local governments from doing certain things. So you have laws that come into play that change certain things. And that's something that Karson's looking at very closely. Chris looks at very closely as well. And so you've even seen in recent days the potential of preemption on police powers in Salt Lake City and others. Those are some examples of things that the state can do as long as they do it with sufficient clarity. They may preempt local governments on things. In addition to that, this is not something new. It's something that all states kind of deal with. And there is that tension between local governments and state governments, just because local governments, when they're governing themselves, when they're working on laws related to the people, they like that autonomy. But then there's also the state elements, especially with the state legislature, that they may make some changes. And so part of Karson's job, and he'll explain this, is to be up there and addressing things. One of the things I've been most impressed with here in the state of Utah is when you have individuals in the private sector like Chris and Karson representing the Utah League of Cities and Towns, and they're working together on legislation that really impacts residents in a more positive way because there's that collaboration. And there are great examples of that, that continual process. The other thing I just want to mention is beyond the legislature and beyond the legislation, there is a lot of work that state and local governments do together on big challenging issues. And when I was city manager in Cottonwood Heights, we had big challenges when we'd have big snowstorms and all the skiers going up to the ski hills, and it caused gridlock even up into the neighborhoods. And so we had the opportunity to sit down with state leaders, look at some potential funding options that might help us in enforcement of some of the laws. And we worked collaboratively to get some funding through the state legislative process and address that. And it's an ongoing process. It's not perfect if you've gone up there recently, but there are things that they're trying to work together on resolving. And that is one thing that I think is very important, especially when we have disasters and other things at the local government level. Working with state collaboratively is very important. So there are some tensions. You recognize that when you go through the state legislative process, when there's bills being proposed that address different things that cities have to change. But there's also collaboration. So there's elements that make it a very positive working relationship. That's all I have to share right now.
Okay, thank you very much for the academic background. I think many times people have in mind the relationship between the federal and the state government, where the federal government has certain rights to control things like, for instance, commerce. And if something is not defined as a federal right, it devolves to the states or the people. So the states and the federal government each have their area carved out where they have primacy. That's different in the state government. The state is the big elephant in the room, and the local government exists only as the state wishes to let it exist. It's not parallel to the way, it's not like always local is better. So I think that's something to keep in mind. So thank you very much. Karson, talk to us about what the League of Cities and Towns does and what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, Karson Eilers with the Utah League of Cities and Towns. I've been with the league for 7, almost 8 years now. We are a nonpartisan interlocal government entity that represents and provides training for all 255 municipal governments in the state. Our members are mayors and council members, so we represent almost, or maybe a couple more than 1,400 or 14,000, or yeah, sorry, 1,400 mayors and council members. It's been a long day. So really what we do, again, we have kind of two arms at our organization, one being the arm that provides training to local governments, because we have our members everywhere from Salt Lake City, which has divisions dedicated to everything from streets to large legal departments, ranging down to small towns like Paraguna, where, a lot of our small towns, and we have more than 100 towns in the state, who oftentimes you have maybe 1 or 2 staffers. Sometimes it's just a clerk who comes in on Wednesdays and makes sure the town runs the business. But you have a council member who is in charge of garbage collection. You have a council member who's in charge of making sure the police are showing up on time. So we really represent the whole gambit of government entities in the state of Utah. Really, municipalities in Utah span that entire range. And I'll just add, I think one thing that I've really grown to appreciate in this job, one of the reasons that I really enjoy it, is working with the individuals who go and serve their communities. Oftentimes, again, you have lay people without any formal education in law or politics who are just saying, you know what, I want to step up and help serve my community. And it's an honor to get to work with them and help them navigate some of the changes that we see coming to our state. Right now, I'm on the advocacy side of things. So I've been at the Capitol since 7:30 this morning, and for the last 29 days, we are currently, as an organization, tracking 242 bills, which is about a quarter of all the bills that have been introduced so far. These range, I mean, we work on almost every issue that cities deal with. So that ranges from tax policy to transportation to land use to elections to short-term rentals to code enforcement. You name it, we probably have some limited interest in it. So as a league, we've really tried, at the direction of our board, to we have principles we uphold. We try to preserve local control and local decision making whenever possible, but at the same time, we recognize that cities can't solve big problems alone, and we need to partner with the state, the private sector, county governments, even the federal government, to come together and solve problems for our collective constituents. So we often use the term partnership, not preemption. Sometimes state leaders start from a different perspective on that. But what we really try to do, whether it's working with state leaders directly, legislators, people in the governor's office, we try to identify what the issue that's been raised is, and then try to work and see if there's a way to empower local governments to help address it, whether that's clarifying state code, whether that's providing more resources, whether that's trying to just create a better process generally for both local governments and the public. We really try to work with stakeholders to figure out how to solve problems without just saying cities shall not do X or Y. And I want to mention, I think that relationship extends to the private sector too, whether it's some people in the home building development community. Chris and I spend many hours together with private sector attorneys, city attorneys, elected officials, trying to work through right now, housing and growth are some of the most difficult challenges that we have to work through as a state. And I think it's really exciting that in Utah we're able to work together and we don't see eye to eye on everything, and we spend a lot of time arguing. But I think we have one of the longest bills right now is a consensus land use bill, which is mostly technical changes. And I think it demonstrates the ability to work together between the public and private sectors and try to solve problems, because there's some issues where we just fundamentally disagree and have to have some political arguments, but there's other issues where we say, look, I think collectively we can work together to create a better process, to create more predictability. Land use is a good example, but that ranges from everything, again, tax policy, transportation. We strive to make sure that state policy is transparent, state policy supports, again, local decision making. That's really core to our values, but just making sure that it's accessible to the public and gives the private sector equitable access and predictive processes. So that's all very vague, but we, again, deal with so many different issues. And yeah, that's what we do at the league. And I'm happy to answer any other questions after Chris presents, but I know that there'll be probably lots of questions and conversations, so I don't want to belabor that point.
Well, let me just follow up with one short question. You represent how many different governmental entities?
So 255 municipalities. So we don't represent counties. We don't represent like community councils. We just represent the elected officials, the 1,400 mayors and council members.
And what about situations where some of your clients want one thing and others of your clients want another thing? How do you interact with that 255 clients?
Yeah, great question. So we at the league really strive to, we really lean heavily on process. So we have a board of directors composed of mayors and council members. And then during the legislative session, when we have, again, hundreds of bills that we're trying to navigate, and some help cities, some may adversely impact cities. We have bills that affect everybody a little bit differently, as you might imagine. And so we have a policy committee, again, composed of voting members. It's a public meeting, but it's composed of mayors and council members and city staff. Tim has been participating in that for a long time. And so we try to come together to discuss issues, and we have some principles that we try to make decisions along. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that our members have the voice and can make decisions. And we try to keep the elected officials, local elected officials, driving the policy conversation. So as staff, we try to advise, but and I'd say most of the time we have a fairly unified membership or a pretty clear consensus. But there are some issues where it's divisive. If it's a 60% consensus, then we have direction. If it's not, we say this is an issue where we have members on both sides of the fence, and we really just kind of we try to address any of the technical issues, but we were not weighing in heavily on either side.
Okay, thank you very much. Chris, tell us about what you've done and are doing.
Yeah, well, thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for the invitation. And as Tim said, we have known each other for a long time, longer than we've known Karson, because he's just a kid. But yeah. So I'm my day job, my actual real job is to direct the land acquisition, entitlement, and development of home sites for Ivory Homes. And we, yeah, sure. I have a team of 12 people at Ivory Development, and my responsibility at Ivory Development is to direct the land acquisition, the entitlement work. So that's the work with local municipalities, and then we actually build the subdivisions, and then turn over finished home sites to Ivory Homes so they can sell homes and build homes. And in 2024, we delivered 1,100 new lots to Ivory Homes during the year. It just doesn't happen at the end of the year. We currently control 30,000 home sites that we own or control that are entitled lots in the state of Utah. That's the 8 counties in Wasatch Front, Tooele County, Wasatch Back, and then also in Washington County. So when I got involved, starting to do land use in the mid-90s, and doing land development, it was still the Wild West. I mean, cities weren't very sophisticated even then, and we were hand drawing plats and hand drawing, like, infrastructure drawings for sewer and water systems, but there was still plenty of NIMBYism. And so, we just kind of put our heads down and muddle through and work with local communities and community councils and neighbors and engage them. And then in about 2004, I got invited to participate in a group that was being chaired by then Senator Greg Bell, who became Lieutenant Governor Bell, but he was a state senator at the time. And it was a group that the League of Cities and Towns and the Association of Counties had put together as a working group to codify what's called LUDMA, or the Land Use Development Management Act. There were, over the years, have been a number of court cases, both Utah Supreme Court cases and federal Supreme Court cases, like Nolan and Dolan and some locals. And the idea was to take all of those and to really clean up the Land Use Development Management Act. That's the state code that allows that authorizes local communities to do planning and development, and it puts a framework around that. There's also a CLUDMA section that is for the County Land Use Development Management Act, and they're quite similar. They're 99.9% identical, except that counties sometimes operate on a county commission versus a county council, and so there are some minor tweaks to it. And so we worked for 6 or 8 months, and I participated on this group, and this is a consensus process where everyone has to come together and agree. And Senator Bell, he really made sure that we were following that. And there were a lot of times when the private sector, the development community, was saying on behalf of property owners, like, well, that doesn't work, or we would really like this language to say, something else. And cities wanted to prohibit some activities like subdividing land by meets and bounds rather than by a subdivision plat, which is really and actually a very important power, that something that we really need to do many times. And so the idea was, well, we'll come back next year. Let's get the consensus stuff done. We'll come back next year. And then when the next year rolled around, 2005, and this Senate bill passed, we went back to the league and said, hey, let's get together and talk about these non-consensus items. And they said, we're actually going to take a couple of years off. Let's see how it works. And we said, well, no, that wasn't the agreement. We were supposed to do these. And so we didn't really have a lot of credibility, because we were the land development community, which had no form. The Home Builders Association had an association, well-known, well-respected. The realtors had their association, well-known, well-respected. But the reality was that as we were looking at the land use to get to, so a home builder can build a home, or a realtor can sell a home, there was this whole process where there was no advocacy for that. And it really was the Wild West. So we formed our group, the Property Rights Coalition, and went back to the league in 2006 and said, let's work on some more consensus items. And so we've been meeting since then. So really, formally in 2004, and then as what we call the Land Use Task Force in 2006, where we sit down with the league as the development community, representing property rights and advocating for fair, consistent, predictable outcomes, things like predictability in general plans when cities adopt a general plan, and then following that general plan, or the predictability of actually following the zoning codes, or conditional use permits, and making sure that cities are actually following the law around conditional use permits. And the terms that we have used over the years, the league likes to talk about powers and duties, and that's what they have. They've got certain powers because the state has granted them that powers. But then they have these duties to exercise those powers responsibly. And property owners have rights and responsibilities. And so, yes, there are property rights, but there's also the responsibility for the property owners to, comply with the ordinances as they exist. Our goal is not to figure out ways to override the league always. Sometimes it is when they do knuckleheaded things. But it's also to hold our industry and the people that operate in the private sector accountable so that we're not causing problems as we're exercising our rights. When Tim was talking about, when he was in the city of, I've worked with Tim in both cities, in both Murray and Cottonwood Heights, but there was a property that came available that was very, very contentious. It was an LDS chapel that actually had been surplus because of an arson incident that had occurred in this chapel in Cottonwood Heights, and the LDS Church decided to surplus this land rather than go in and refurbish it. And man, we had some really heated conversations with neighbors, and Tim was able to work through that, and we were able to do that. But one thing that we heard a lot, and we do hear a lot, is that, but what about don't the cities have rights? And the answer is no. Cities do not have rights. They have powers and duties. People have rights. And so no, there's no such thing as a city right. Unlike a state right that under the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, we talk about federal authority and states' rights, and we probably are even saying that wrong, because states have responsibilities, and they also have powers and duties. But it's been it hasn't always been a fun. Sometimes we've gotten into some very serious arguments. We've had on both sides. We've actually had people that were participating. It's a completely voluntary process. No one is forcing anyone to be there. But the cities know that if we have concerns as a home builder or as a property rights entity, and if the cities are not taking our concerns seriously, we have the right to go and petition our government. We have the right to go to the state government and petition them for relief. And what they don't want is they don't want us to go up with a bill that they haven't seen yet, that they might disagree with, because we're both going to spend way too much time arguing about it. And if there's something that the legislature really doesn't like, it's really contentious. I know that sometimes they get involved and they wade into certain things, but when it comes to land use and city, powers and duties, they don't really like that. So we have this accord, we meet, and we come to consensus, and our consensus bill is over 7,000 lines. And it's a lot of technical cleanup but for everyone pulling together, there would be a lot of problems in state code where there's some inconsistencies. So happy to pause there and hear some questions.
So let me just pose a couple of questions to you all, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Let's step away from the land development for a minute, because there are lots of things that the legislature might legislate about that tells cities what they're allowed, or other local governments what they're allowed to do. And I could name some of them that have nothing to do with land. Do you have an individual philosophy, or is there an academic theory about ideally when we should accommodate the local government, and ideally when we really should want the state to decide?
So I'll try to opine on that one a little bit. So I think one of the superpowers of local government is that the state can set a high level policy, but then local government can have some variation in how that's implemented. And again, coming back to the idea that you have everywhere from large cities and tiny towns, you do have some different interests there. You have different political dynamics. For example, the Salt Lake City Council has chosen to have a higher tax rate than most small towns. So the state says you can authorize these different sales tax quarters or these different sales tax amounts for these different purposes, but you have local options. So the local government can say, we think this is the right fit for our community. The state still says you can't go above X, but cities and towns have the option to say, we need to fund this additional service. We need to pay for this road. We need to do X, Y, and Z. So that gives them the option. And that, I think, ultimately maximizes the amount of services that local governments can provide while minimizing the tax burden on residents, because like some of the services that Salt Lake City provides, you have small towns whose residents don't really need those services. They say this is fine being done at the county level. So I think when you have areas where the state can say, overriding policy, we're going to say, here's how this can be approached, and leave that implementation flexible. That's sort of our sweet spot, I'd say. And land use, that, well, we're evaluating land use, but
You can include land
yeah.
use. I just didn't want to make it just about
land
land use.
yeah, well, I think a good example there. 2 years ago, we worked on a bill to change the subdivision process, which sounds pretty dry to anybody who doesn't work in this space. But I think, and it was a consensus driven approach. It was a lot of work by both sides to try to figure out how we can improve this, again, relatively arcane process, but at the same time, trying to say, here's a high level policy, cities, you have some flexibility in how you implement it. And every city and town in the state has either implemented or is in the last couple of steps of implementing it. And the way we did it, I think it provides a lot more predictability to the public and how they can plan for new development. It provides a lot more consistency and to the development community, and it provides a lot clear process to local governments and how the steps that you should take. So again, that was one where it took a lot of work to get everybody on board, to help local governments implement and understand it. It took some resources from the state to be able to help small communities who don't have planning staff or don't have full-time attorneys contract with third parties, firms, to help update their ordinances. But at the end of the day, I think that actually got to a much better policy outcome for everybody involved, despite the fact that it was a lot of work, despite the fact that there was some degree of state leaning into local interests. But that's kind of another example of where you have that balancing test that you have to provide. And I think a lot of times working together, you can figure out a way to provide everybody's interest.
And this somewhat applies, going back to a theorist, there's an individual lived quite a long time ago her name was Mary Parker Follett. And she was one of the leading figures in organizations and theory. She consulted with different countries. She's one of the great people in the field of public administration. One of the things she talked about is when you have conflict between organizations or between individuals, it's better to address the conflict, work instead of power over, have power with, to create policies or have better situations. I always like to think about that in relations with whether it's state and local or private sector. But there are times where probably the state government are better suited to address issues. For example, there is a thing called light rail and tracks that goes through multiple cities. It impacts the city I live in right now, obviously, and did in that process, but having the state more involved in overseeing that process and working with the cities in that type of use and that type of service is an area that I think is better suited to do rather than local governments. That might be an example.
Thank you. Let me try another example, because I think this is the Salt Lake League. And I think there are many instances where the Salt Lake residents think they're not really happy with the state government telling Salt Lake they're not allowed to do what Salt Lake wants to do. Because whatever, someone else elsewhere thinks that's a bad thing. But one place where I think Salt Lake probably was in favor of what the state made everyone do is every community had to provide for homeless shelters. Yeah. And there's been some politics about some other communities aren't providing for enough homeless shelters in the news recently, but there where each local government is saying, not in my neighborhood, push off the poor to another neighborhood, push the same thing with density of housing. Push off the dense housing to another neighborhood. We don't want any dense housing here. I think there you've got a situation where the state may be taking control because all of the local governments are likely to say we don't want that in our backyard. And it has to be somewhere, so okay, it's going to be everywhere. That may be like transportation.
Yeah, that's a great example. And for example, the homeless issue is not just a Salt Lake City issue. It's really, we're all impacted by that. And
except if the services are here they come here, and all of a sudden Salt Lake's at fault.
Yeah, and so, yeah, that's a great example to me of the state stepping in and working with municipalities and leaders in that to try to address that issue, and also making some of the financial burden not just be upon Salt Lake City, but upon all the municipalities, not just in Salt Lake County now, but others. And so that's a great example of where the state probably needs to step in and address those issues.
Well, and just to add on to that, what we actually did a couple of years ago was say, recognizing that some of the communities with shelters face a disproportionate public safety impact around the shelters, whether it's for ambulance services, paramedics, police. So the state actually said every local government in the state is going to contribute a small amount of sales tax, which in the aggregate, it's not a small amount. So there's several millions of dollars that are collected every year from every local government that doesn't have a shelter, a full-time shelter. So that was a way to try to say, we recognize this is a statewide problem that's disproportionately fallen on a couple of communities. Let's help try to mitigate those costs that they face. But even then, we have a state requirement now that urban municipalities during the winter try to work together with their counties to locate a site for a shelter.
Warming shelters.
Warming shelter, yep. And, Weaver County, Davis County, Salt Lake County, Utah County all worked together to come up with some kind of model. And it was, I'd say maybe more challenging in some than others, but you also saw some cities step up and say, you know what, we're going to work with our residents to try to figure out a way forward on this. We want to try to help the most vulnerable. And I think you also had some really good stories come out of that.
Now, let me turn the tables then. Can we think of some examples where the state seized power in a place that probably wasn't wise? Well, the inland port, I think some people are offended by Salt Lake not having much to say. I mean, I can think of some small stuff like you can't legislate against plastic bags.
Yeah.
Some cities in other parts of the country will have a rule against plastic bags in the city, and in other more rural neighborhoods, there won't be a rule against plastic bags. Interestingly, the Harmon's I shop at never has plastic bags. But another Harmon's I've gone to in another part of Salt Lake County has lots of plastic bags. So Harmon's itself has decided that some neighborhoods, nobody wants plastic bags, and other neighborhoods, people want plastic bags. And so I imagine that rule was thought to be necessary because the grocery stores like Harmon's couldn't be forced to act differently in Salt Lake City, but Harmon's is acting differently in different stores. So that's just an example where I'm not seeing the statewide interest in plastic bags.
And Linda, can you talk about Moab? Because Moab did want to ban plastic bags, and the state did not allow them.
Right,
So
that's an example of, I'm not sure why that's a state issue, that Moab might have some interesting reasons for keeping their pristine natural area free of plastic bags that maybe not all of us have that same interest. So anyway, you guys can talk about plastic bags or not.
We fought off that bill for 2 or 3 years in a row.
And
there
then you
was-
lost.
No, we still have that authority. But it was an interesting issue because, you know, on its face, it seems like a maybe like environmental versus non-environmental issue. But it really, what it came down to is you have a couple of these communities, whether Park City became kind of the poster child, but it became a massive cost impact for them because you have a town with a very small nighttime population paying for all the waste impacts of a huge tourism community. So their landfill, they actually went through and calculated how much money they spent cleaning the plastic bags out of the belts and the machines. So they actually had a real policy case just beyond the environmental concern. And this was early on in my time in the league, but one of my favorite moments was on the House floor when their Republican legislator at the time stood up and said, I firmly disagree with Park City's policy. I think he called it stupid, but said, I will, with my last breath, defend Park City's right to be stupid. And it was such a rousing moment. But I think that was one of those issues where our members said, look, most cities had no interest in adopting a plastic bag ordinance. They didn't need it because they either had a landfill facility that was run by the county or they just didn't have the need. And but it was one where cities came together and said, we think should be a local control issue and not a state policy.
But the law passed in the state level that, no?
Not to my knowledge.
So is it a state law that says you can't dictate the kind of packaging of plastic bag?
Kathy, you know the answer to that?
I think it is a state law that you can't ban plastic bags in the city.
So.
We'll
so
have to check.
I'll be the private sector. Why does the city, if the customer base of the business doesn't want them, then the business will respond to that? Because I also shop at the Harmons in Brickyard, and they're going through plastic bags like crazy, and I see that, and I always feel really bad when I forget to take my reusable bag in, which is about every other time, and I feel terrible about
You
it.
could buy another one at Harmon's.
I know, but I have so many in my trunk of my car.
And then you can donate that to the poor.
But as the private sector is like, what is the interest of local government to dictate whether someone can choose a plastic bag or not? And that is really the rub of local control. And it is, there are so many times when in my really long career working in state and local, and not in local governments, but with local governments for 3 decades, where I see local governments think that they need to control every aspect of what happens, and they just don't. And so what the legislature's saying is, let the people decide if they want a plastic bag or not.
I think the answer was Park City had a garbage problem, and Moab has a visibility. You don't really like the plastic bag hanging in the tree if you're trying to take a picture of the arches. I don't think it's true in every city, but I think Park City and Moab had an argument.
I do think Chris brings up a good point though, and like what is the public sector's interest in that policy? And I think when you have areas where that can be clearly articulated, whether that's municipal law, state law, county law, federal law, like I think generally as the public sector, we should be able to articulate our interests clearly, be able to articulate the cost and benefit that it drives. I mean, almost any regulation that a city or county or state imposes has some impact on people's ability, whether it's business or an individual ability to act in a certain way. I think it's important that policymakers are able to say, here's the government interest in doing this, and hopefully cities and counties and the state are able to do that when they pass new policies. But I think that is an important thing that government entities should bear in mind.
Don't write a law if we don't need one, whether you're a city or a state or a federal. Okay. Do you folks want to say anything else to each other? We'll take some questions from the audience, and then I'll have some more questions if the audience doesn't get feisty enough. You have to walk up here to one of these mics. Can you turn on that mic over there? Like that one, if you put, Linda, turn on that mic for me.
Now,
Is this one?
Am I allowed to ask 2 questions?
Yes.
But only two.
All right, my first question is for you, Parker.
Carson, yes.
Karson, sorry.
That's okay.
Could you please is there a quick way to explain the difference between cities, townships, municipalities, incorporated and unincorporated districts?
I will try to be quick. Yeah, so basically, so municipal government includes a town, a city, and a metro township. Metro townships are unique to Salt Lake County, and although some still have the name metro township, they've actually been, they had limited powers that cities didn't use, or that they had limited powers that cities had that they didn't before. A law changed, well, it's kind of gradually shifted over the last couple of years. So now metro townships are full-blown municipalities, so they have all the same powers and duties that any other municipality has.
Like Magna would be an
Yeah.
example of
Yep.
that.
Magna, Immigration, Kearns. So that's been kind of a change. That was sort of a unique policy for a couple of years where the state said, we have all these unincorporated areas in the county and you have different service costs. And so it's kind of challenging. So any area that you have a municipality is by definition incorporated. The difference between a town and a city is just based on population. State code says you have these different thresholds. Like if you have under 1,000 residents, you're a town. More than that, you're a city, and there's different classifications to be able to say, you know, a 5th class city, a small city is different than a 1st or 2nd class, like a capital city. So
Right.
that's the clearest delineation. There's not a lot of difference. Like if it's a municipality, it's municipality. Then unincorporated county is just any area that's not formally incorporated. Sometimes services are provided by the county, an adjacent city, special service districts, any of the above.
Because that seems to be a bone of contention for residents when they are and are not getting the same services as their neighbors.
If I may just add, in that unincorporated versus incorporated, there was a law that was passed last year that is most likely going to do away with the unincorporated areas, that they'll be absorbed within 3 years by the largest city, or they can incorporate on their own or pick the city that they want to be a part of. So probably fairly soon, within 2 years, you're probably going to see unincorporated areas going away.
But only
In
in Salt
Salt
Lake
Lake County.
County.
Salt Lake
In
County.
Salt Lake County.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not in the other, but in the Salt Lake County.
And it seems that the mapping of all of that has been a challenge for the county, for sure. My second question, Chris, is why do you think that, or do you think we will ever see a day when any kind of reference to policy or land use development will be automatically coupled with water and land use? Why can't we always talk about water and land use by
Yeah,
developers?
That is a great question. And the answer is we are already doing that.
Well, you didn't say the word water once.
Water is an asset that is owned by the people, that is allowed to be used through water rights and water shares. Generally, the shares come from water companies that have water rights. There are we somewhat we call the large water districts the water buffaloes, because they're really, really large and serve significant regional areas. Salt Lake City is not served by a water district. It's served by Salt Lake Municipal, and actually parts of Holiday and Mill Creek and Sandy and Cottonwood Heights. Salt Lake Public Utilities go into those areas as well. So it depends on where the development activity is taking place. So if it's an emerging city, a high growth city, for instance, like an Eagle Mountain, that doesn't have a bank of water like Salt Lake City does, in order to develop that property, an applicant has to take water, wet water, or the ability to transfer wet water into the service area. So Eagle Mountain is a customer of Central Water Project, CWP. And so they buy the water, they buy their municipal water from CWB. That's not the case in Cottonwood Heights. We don't have to take water with us to Cottonwood Heights because Salt Lake Public Utility already has, they own 5 times more water than Salt Lake City could ever use. They have acquired more water over the years than they could ever use, and they're leasing it out actually to other users. And so it's dependent on location, it's dependent on the infrastructure, who owns the water tanks. It's a much more nuanced question than just, and so the other side of that, I guess, is when are we going to run out of water? And the reality is, we're not for a really long time, unless we have unless there's a significant period of time, and I mean decades of droughts. But 85% of water in Utah is used by agriculture. 15% is what's called M&I, municipal and industrial. And when this is just it's one of the hard things to understand is that when you look at a farmer who's changed over their farming operation from flood irrigation to a pivot system, they're actually using the same amount of water. What the pivot system allows them to do is to get 4 cuts of crops rather than 2 cuts of crops. So they're still using the same amount of water to irrigate alfalfa that goes on trains, that goes, or wheat that goes to China. So we're literally exporting 85% of our water in Utah out of the country. And so it's about reallocating of the resources. Because if we can support 3.4 million people on 15% of the water in Utah, if we reallocate some of those resources, we're not going to run out of water very quick.
I guess that's right. I'm just sort of wondering at the lay person, if they see it all together in terms of just water usage and rather than development. But thank you for that answer.
Is there another question in the room, or do we have a question online? Yes, Haley, come on up. Come on down. Now here we have some expertise in city planning. Want to go over there to that mic?
I wrote it down so I wouldn't trip over my words. Okay. This is back to the plastic bags. Sorry again in advance. But at what point is the element of choice no longer a good thing in terms of like legislating instead and regulating? When it comes to things like this, I feel like it fully disregards the issue at large, which is clean air and water, and how will we ever make big picture legislation? You can't understand me?
Slow down.
Yeah, slow down.
Sorry, guys. Okay.
A slow speech.
Too bad I'm not in speech class. Okay. On plastic bags, at what point is the element of choice no longer a good thing when it comes to things like this? I feel like it fully disregards the issue at large, which is clean air and water. How will we ever make big picture legislation possible if we keep tying the hands of cities instead of regulating bags just for the good of the environment? I don't know if that was a cohesive
question about plastic bags.
Thanks, guys.
Tim, you haven't spoken to the plastic bag issue yet.
I guess I haven't spoken. I mean, it's a policy issue, and it's a policy priority that legislators have, and there's a lot of different viewpoints on that and on environmental quality and on environmental issues. And I feel like there are at times things that come to the level of concern with environmental issues at the state legislature, and they're addressing some things, but when it comes right down to it, I think it goes back a lot to what Chris said. What point and what is the threshold of when you should regulate versus not regulate on these issues? And that's really a policy question that has to be determined by elected officials that are elected, and so there's probably not a really great answer other than it's a policy issue that they have to decide on. That's as good as I can get.
Yeah. Well, that's a good answer. I don't have a dog in the plastic bag fight. But from a principle standpoint, from the practical standpoint, the choice is what if if I were a legislator, I would say, the choice is the customer's choice. And it's not to be dictated by local government to dictate what happens, what people choose to do. And so I try to remember my reusable bags all the time. But that was the argument. Those were the conversations that we were having at the Capitol. I wasn't in them. I was listening to them. And they were just saying, let people decide. And if they don't want to use a plastic bag, then they don't have to. But why does local government, who the purpose of local government is health, safety, and welfare. And that for the entirety of our country up until the 1920s meant police, fire, it meant health departments, roads. It didn't mean local government interference in people's lives. That's not what it did not mean that. In the 1920s, it with zoning and the Euclid decision in the Supreme Court, cities got very broad authority to intervene in people's lives. And so
Don't you think zoning was a good idea?
zoning's a terrible idea. Planning is a good idea.
Okay, but I mean,
Planning and zoning are not the same things.
okay, but zoning is part of how you effectuate the plan,
Uh-huh.
right? And so you're for that now.
Nope.
Well, Chris and I'll have to disagree
Yeah,
on
we've
this.
had some longstanding disagreements.
About planning.
But-
So let me make the anti-libertarian point that the legislature could take the position of those idiots not letting people have a choice just to eliminate polluting oil products that are killing the earth. Let them rule out plastic bags, and then all the shoppers will go to another city. And then they'll find out that they're losing tax money because they've made a dumb choice. Why not just let the city make the dumb choice and see whether the market slaps them in the face? You know, let
think-
the cities do dumb things, and maybe it'll turn out. I mean, many things that the legislature has legislated against that progressives have not liked, like for instance, rent control, have in fact turned out to be negative in communities where they have rent control. It's been ultimately a bad idea to have rent control, despite the fact that progressives for some time were offended that rent control was not allowed to be. So you don't know until you try it, and then you try it, you find out. And having a nation where different communities can have different rules allows us to find out. So that's the beauty of the American way with different policies. Yes.
Can I just add to the, one of the challenges, and when I was a city manager and working for municipal government, there are a lot of differing viewpoints on policy issues. And one of the hard things to really understand is what the public interest is. I mean, you might have elements of it that you think you're probably there, but to me, unless you're surveying, doing scientific surveys on your residents every other day on issues, what is the public interest? There were times where I thought there, in my mind, were issues that this is very much in the public interest of what we should pursue. And 4 or 5 people come to a city council meeting, very emotional, and a decision is made against what I thought was in the public interest. So one of the challenges that elected officials have, both at the state level and local government level, is understanding the public interest. Sometimes it's termed in the theoretical side of things, satisficing. They have to make decisions with not maybe all of the big picture on things, or not understanding the full big picture, or not completely understanding what the full public interest is, but taking the limited information that they have in the limited amount of time they have and making decisions. And sometimes those decisions don't work. Sometimes they do. And that's the challenge of our political system and the public policy process, is that really understanding what the public interest is.
I think we have a question online. Thank you, Haley. Shauna, do you have a question online?
I do. This is from one of our online members. She's asking, how do we prevent groups like the Inland Port from using tax dollars but creating a board that excludes taxpayers, cities, and possibly the state from having any say.
Oh, boy. Um,
How do we do that? Karson?
Yeah, I think whether it's the Inland Port or some of these other groups, I think there is I do think you have more and more state elected officials looking at ways that you have some of these like very limited purpose governmental entities that are for, development specific projects, which may receive tax funding. They might be like a largely independent enterprise. So I do think there's been more of those in the past couple of years, whether it's the Inland Port, whether it's there's just been kind of a few like the Utah Lake Authority, which has now been sort of spun off. And I think right now the state is kind of grappling with how to make sure that there's some elected involvement. I think that proponents of, or I think for a long time there was some frustration with the Inland Port at the local government level, or concern that there wasn't more involvement. But I do think that during that discussion, the initial version largely precluded Salt Lake City's elected officials from being involved, and kind of subsequent negotiations, again, like kind of city and state partnership, the city's been able to come to the table more, and the state's modified the Inland Port structure to bring them. And even if you look at some of the spokes off of the Inland Port, they call them these kind of other facilities located throughout the state in more rural areas. Those have been done much more in partnership than the original Inland Port bill back in, I don't remember when that happened, maybe 2018, 2019. Some of these other models actually have been like the city or county governments have said, look, we want this logistics facility. So I think that there's been a lot of positive changes there to try to incorporate more local involvement, more local decision making. Again, I think this is one of those, you've highlighted one of these real friction points about, to what degree should local government be involved, and if it's making local land use decisions, the league, we would feel very strongly that we should have like almost entirely local involvement. But at the same time, if you have some of these very narrow, almost more akin to a state special district, that is a little bit of a different entity. And if they're not using public tax dollars or general fund dollars, it's a little bit of a different scenario. That's not a very clear answer, because I don't have a very clear answer. But again, I think we've seen a positive step in that direction, and hopefully we continue to see that.
Well, and if I may add to Karson's, and I know that there may be other examples that are not great, but since that Inland Port, like you said, there have been some concessions made to bring some more involvement, maybe not as much as some people would want to see. But then you have other entities that are formed, like the Point, which is down south, and that's a pretty wide and broad representation of both municipality, state. It's a state property.
Yeah.
They're still focused on the land use elements in that, but there is significant involvement of mayors and others that this property is located in, which is to me a better step than what we had back in 2018, where the Inland Port kind of that initial legislation caused some issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to try to mix it up now a little bit with land use, because we're going to initiate a little argument here. Because we've been following the gravel pit issue, which is currently House Bill 355. Now, last year, there was a proposal to expand the rights of people with vested interests in mining and gravel aggregate. And after a couple bills were considered, there was a study commissioned, and the study was done. And the study said, and I'm going to cut to the chase. Yes, it's important to have aggregate for construction, and it's cheaper to have aggregate near to where the construction is, but we don't have a crisis in not having enough aggregate. We've got more than enough, at least until 2060. Most of the construction right now in Salt Lake County is in the southwest part of the county, and that's where the aggregate is, in the southwest part of the county. So the study did not see any needs to require each county to have a certain number of quarries. And the study was asked to look at who should have control over quarries for aggregate. And the study said it should be the local government that should retain the ultimate control over quarries. Now we come up to 355, and the substitute bill, which was better than the original bill, says that anybody that is currently an operator with a vested right has a right to develop a quarry on any property they own, any place in Utah, and on adjacent properties. And that's surprising. Why any place in Utah? But then the local government is to be given notice before an expansion and is to have a hearing, a quick hearing within 30 days at the next meeting. And if the local government finds that the quarry will harm the health, safety, and welfare of the population, they can say, we find this. And then they are to come up, the local government is to come up with a mitigation plan. And if the owner of the vested rights agrees to follow the mitigation plan, then they can mine. What the current bill does not say is what happens if the owner doesn't follow the mitigation plan? Or can the local government say, we can't come up with an appropriate mitigation plan? Putting a quarry here is going to be unhealthy, nor does it say unhealthy is enough. It has to be unhealthy and unsafe and against the general welfare. I don't think there are very many things that are both unhealthy and unsafe, but it doesn't have to be imminent anymore, just ultimately unhealthy and unsafe. So given that, what's the possibility? I know, I understand that the construction industry is really, really, really interested in doing something to enhance access to aggregate. What's the possibility of watering this down a little bit to allow local governments, which the state study should have ultimate control, be able to say yes or no to a quarry?
Well, I don't know what that, I'd say negotiations are ongoing, so I think it's still, we still have plenty of time left in the legislative session to try to answer that question. And gravel pits are a really interesting example where you have competing uses, right? Like this was less of an issue maybe 40 years ago when the gravel pit was still
Far
quite a ways away from the homes. And now that you have, I mean, every time I drive north from my house, northern and kind of the northern edge of Salt Lake, you see the large gravel pit there, right by 89, and then you see the homes right on top of it. Same with down by Draper, where you have homes coming up right to the properties, and you have both of those needs where you need more houses for people and you need the aggregate to build those houses and build the freeways and everything. And so you really have these, it is a really tricky competing interest. Now, obviously, we believe that all of this should be done at the local planning level, and we should be able to determine the degree that they can expand. And I do want to recognize that this bill is quite a bit better than the bill last year. We think it's still, as drafted, goes too far into restricting local control and the ability of local governments to mitigate those impacts, whether it's dust, whether it's noise, whether it's rocks on residential roads and large gravel trucks going through school zones. Like those are real impacts that people near the gravel pits feel that people who aren't near them don't experience. So we would take the position that local governments, we try to maximize that decision making to try to minimize the impacts on residents, and let the gravel pits keep operating without, try to reduce the friction between those two parties. But whether it's, I mean, this is an old story with agriculture where you have homes moving to adjacent to a farm, and the residents are concerned about the smells and the noise, and so I think it's a really difficult issue without a clear answer. But we would say that we think local governments can maximize that balance if given the chance. But again, I do want to recognize that the sponsor, I think, has recognized a lot of the concerns and has come a long way. We're not there yet, but
The sub is better than the original.
Yeah.
And it's better than last year's.
Yep.
But it's still a little ways to go.
Yep.
Because ultimately, it doesn't say that local government can ever say no. Do you want to speak? Anybody else want to speak to gravel pits?
You have a gravel pit there's a gravel pit in Cottonwood.
Oh,
Heights,
yeah.
right?
I'll just tell you, I would agree with Karson that those impacts are real. I mean, a city manager for almost 6 years in Cottonwood Heights, I don't know if there was a week that went by that I didn't get calls with concerns about the noise or about the dust or about the issues with the gravel pit. maybe I'm exaggerating, but at least not a month. Or I would get calls all the time, and those concerns were real. The impacts are real on adjacent property owners. Interesting with that issue is the gravel pit was there long before the homes. But you know, the concerns were there. We would contact the gravel pit operators often. I had their phone number almost memorized, and we would work with them to try to mitigate the concerns. But
Spray the dust, spray the
it
dust.
It was an ongoing issue, and the hours of operation was kind of the big one, where they were starting early in the morning and waking people up with some of the big equipment. So the concerns are real. They're legitimate, and hopefully this bill can balance some of those elements. And it sounds like you're working towards that.
Okay. Yes, okay, one more we've motivated one more question from the audience.
Mine's a softball, don't be afraid of me.
That one's not on unless you hit the button.
Yep, she got it.
Okay.
So my interest in politics is relatively recent. So I've never actually asked myself, what are the regular communication channels between municipalities and the state? Or is it limited to, you know, lobbyists and legislators, or work with a league or a specific task force? You know, because in my own organization, you know, we have staff meetings. Like, is there a regular communication channel between the state and the cities?
I can start and maybe, so in my experience, we had multiple communication channels. So relationships matter in the work of municipalities and state government. And so we oftentimes had specific issues that would come up where we would be contacting and working with state officials, not necessarily elected officials, but sometimes if there were concerns. And so those were very specific issues that would come up, and we would work for them in a certain amount of time. Then others where there were bigger issues, like I mentioned earlier with the traffic and issues up on Wasatch Boulevard, we would have fairly regular meetings with UDOT officials and others. And ultimately, those meetings would address certain issues like that. Then we had lobbyists that were working with the league that would be talking to our elected officials on a variety of different issues. So I guess to sum it all up, there's a lot of different ways. There were times where we were meeting weekly with state officials on issues, and kind of had an ongoing weekly meeting with them over some of the bigger issues. So it's varied, and it's problem specific,
Okay.
and then it's collaborative as well on a variety of different levels. And then when the legislative session comes about, it all ramps up significantly. I mean, I got really tired of my lobbyists calling me at 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night every day of the session on issues or things that we had to read. And then they would contact and work with our elected officials, and I would as well at times.
Okay, thank you.
All right, do we have one more online? One more question from online.
So this maybe is a good kind of summary up, just as we're thinking about state and local relations and how we can make an impact. One of our people, they just want you each to comment on whether you consider public interest, quote unquote, to be synonymous with the loudest voices, quote unquote. And given that answer, what should we do?
I'll
Your
start.
Summation, yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't agree with that. I struggle a lot with public clamor. I did when I was in local government. Sometimes that public clamor and some very emotional, sometimes 3 or 4 people could change policy significantly. And so I think it's so critical for elected officials at the state and local level to really strive to understand public interest. That includes going through processes to survey your residents, to create environments where you can have conversations to really understand kind of what are the big issues. But I've always really struggled with that public clamor driving policies that probably aren't in the best interest of the whole community or whole municipality or even the state at times.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Tim. nothing brings out public clamor like a subdivision being proposed near your home. I can tell you, I've sat
Want
through.
this field to stay here.
Yeah, I mean,
Keep the cows.
just like the field I moved onto, right? But you know what people don't protest? They don't protest Costco's or retail centers. In fact, cities pass. They give them tax dollars. They give them TIF money, tax increment financing, and so as the value of the property increases, the developer of those uses is able to skim part of that to reimburse them for infrastructure. I've been in probably not as many public hearings as you have, but probably close. And man, nothing brings out public clamor like some kind of a proposal that people perceive will bring somebody less affluent than them into their neighborhood. And that's what, and they say things like property values, they say crime. So they say the word, they actually say it. And then they say, but we're not NIMBYs. We just think that every project needs to be looked at individually, and this one just doesn't work. And we know there's a housing crisis, but this shouldn't go here. But man, you tell them that they're going to get a new retail center, and people are lined up. They go to the ribbon cutting. They can't get to the Olive Garden fast enough, you know. So no, the public interest is not necessarily what happens at a city council meeting or in a legislative hearing or in a congressional hearing. And that's why we elect people to try to discern, you know, the noise from what the public policy interest is. And we use that term a lot in our negotiations, and the league says it back, like, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? And is there a public interest in doing this? Is there a benefit in doing it? And so, you know, we do our best in the public policy realm, and me just from the outside, you know, trying to influence outcomes. But most often the loudest voices are the least relevant, and it's because the people who are the loudest voices generally have the worst arguments.
They're looking at it from only one perspective and not from,
Yep.
they're not able to talk about more than one perspective.
Yeah, I would agree. I think part of the reason cities are often criticized for being slow to act, and partly that's because cities plan and survey and do a lot of work before making a lot of decisions. That is true in the land use space, where we have a whole bunch of different planning requirements. That's true in infrastructure planning, where we have to, you know, develop capital facilities plans. We have to figure out plan for how we spend tax dollars. And I think that's actually, again, while people often see that as red tape and are frustrated with cities being slow to act on things, I think that's actually really valuable, because during that time, it encourages local leaders, and this is again true at every level of government, it encourages elected officials to step back and look at the big picture, to try to actually quantify what the change is, whether it's building a new skate park, whether it's support or approving a new subdivision, whether it's funding a new road, whether it's providing a new service, changing the trash day. All of these things, again, like it's often referred to as bureaucracy, red tape, but it's really trying to be decisive, trying to make measurable decisions. So you can go back to your residents when they're frustrated and say, look, here's the reasoning for this. If it's approving a subdivision that they're concerned about, being able to tell them, look, we have this whole traffic study, we have a traffic plan to be able to show you. And it doesn't always work in resolving resident concerns, but I think people who are frustrated, and I don't love the term public clamor, because I think a lot of times it's just people concerned about change, and sometimes there are maybe concerning elements to that, and it's expressed in a way that is problematic. But I think oftentimes it's just people want to protect their neighborhoods. And I think the more that cities can plan ahead, can think through what the decision means, and then go back to the public and say, whether it's a tax increase, whether it's a subdivision approval, here's the reasoning for the decision. Here's why we think this helps you. I think that both helps address, maybe not all, but some of the concern from the public, and also helps the government entity define their interests and arrive at a better public policy outcome.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to say, join me in thanking our panelists, please. And then I'm going to excuse our panelists because I have a few announcements to the League of Women Voters that I don't want to make them have to sit and listen to. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to meet you.
Yeah. Good to meet you. Oh, see, that wasn't so bad. Thanks so much. Okay, so just a few final announcements. Everyone who has found tonight's event useful, please take a few minutes to like or share us on your related posts, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever there still is out there. Some announcements for up next at the League. Our unit meetings are meeting. Probably most of them are going to be carrying on a discussion about this. So figuring out what we're going to do local or statewide. Night Owls meet on the fourth Monday of the month, which will be Monday, February 24th at 7:30 p.m. and on Zoom. They are now meeting at the Community of Grace Presbyterian Church, 2015 East Newcastle Drive in Sandy. The Nightingales meets the last Tuesday of the month, which will be Tuesday, February 22nd at Judy Short's home at 7:30 p.m. Is the town club meeting on March 6th? The town club is too exhausted with legislative action to meet in its regular meeting, but ordinarily the town club meets the first Thursday of the month. The Wasatch Scholars, however, should be meeting at the University of Utah campus on Wednesday, February 26th. So we've got 3 meetings next week, bing, bang, bong, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. In March, we will not have a Salt Lake General meeting because the Utah League will be offering a Zoom meeting to wrap up the legislative session. So we don't know quite when, and we don't know quite what.
March 13th is when the wrap up.
Okay, it's March 13th.
We will have the federal judiciary study.
Okay.
We have to come to consensus on by the end of April.
Okay, so let me say this because you won't have been picked up by the mic. So March 13th, there will be a Zoom meeting put on by the Utah League regarding the legislative session. And then following that, on what date?
Whenever your units meet, we will be talking about the federal judiciary study.
Okay, the federal league has put together a judiciary study of the federal judiciary, and it will be distributed to the units, and the units will meet about that and come to consensus before the end of April.
I think it's April 24th.
Before April 24th. So lots of excitement coming down the pike. So if there are no other.
How would one of us be able to attend the March 13th?
It's going to be on Zoom. The Zoom link will be on the Utah League website. So it'll be League of Women Voters Utah, lwvutah.org, and there'll be a link there to the Zoom meeting. And you should be getting the weekly briefing, and the Salt Lake weekly briefing should say that as well. Haley, pick up on that.
Putting out a president's letter every week during the session to all of our members.
So the president's memo will go out advertising that. So if anybody else, does anybody else in the audience have something you want me to announce into the microphone? No. Okay. Thank you all very much for your attendance. I really appreciate that. And goodbye, online people too. I counted 27 people, Shauna.
Just wanted to say, I'm not trying to tell you, your mom died.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.